From the moment I laid eyes on Julia at her father's memorial service, I knew she was my ticket to a life of luxury. I wasn't there to pay respects or offer condolences. I was there to secure my future. Julia was a beautiful woman, no doubt, with her delicate features and warm smile, but it was her inherited wealth that truly captivated me. Her father had been an influential figure, and with his sudden passing, the keys to his empire were now in Julia's hands. I needed to make sure that I became a part of her life before she realized the full extent of her power. It wasn't hard to charm her. Julia was vulnerable, grieving, and in need of comfort. I played the role of the concerned admirer perfectly, always there with a kind word or a shoulder to cry on. It didn't take long for her to start relying on me, confiding in me, and eventually falling for me. Every time I saw her smile at me, I knew I was one step closer to securing my future. One evening, as we sat in her spacious living room, the air thick with the scent of jasmine from the garden outside, I decided it was time to make my move. "Louis," Julia said, her voice soft and unsure, "I don't know what I'd do without you. You've been so good to me through all of this." I leaned in closer, taking her hand in mine. "You don't have to worry about that, Julia. I'll always be here for you. I care about you more than anything." She smiled, a small, sad smile that tugged at my heartstrings. Not because I loved her, but because I knew that she was completely under my spell. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just feel so lost sometimes. With Dad gone, it's like I don't know how to handle everything on my own. That's why you don't have to do it alone," I said, my voice full of practiced sincerity. "You have me now, and together we can face anything." Julia's eyes searched mine, looking for reassurance, and I made sure to give it to her. It wasn't long before she nodded, leaning into me, and I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close. In that moment, I knew I had her. The next few months were a blur of dates, romantic gestures, and whispered promises. I made sure to be everything she needed: a protector, a confidant, a lover. I could see the love in her eyes every time she looked at me, and it only fueled my determination to seal the deal. Finally, the day came when I knew it was time to propose. I took her to the botanical gardens, a place she loved for its serenity and beauty. The setting sun bathed the garden in a golden light, and as we walked hand in hand, I led her to a secluded spot near a pond. "Julia," I began, turning to face her, "these past few months have been the happiest of my life. I can't imagine my future without you in it." Her eyes widened, and she brought her free hand to her mouth, already guessing where this was going. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you," I continued, pulling out a small velvet box from my pocket and dropping to one knee. "Will you marry me?" Julia's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. She nodded vigorously, unable to speak, and I slipped the ring onto her finger as she whispered a trembling "yes." I stood up, pulling her into my arms as she laughed and cried at the same time. I kissed her, sealing the promise that would soon make me a very wealthy man. But as I held her, my mind was already calculating. The wedding, the wealth, the life that lay ahead. I was on the verge of everything I had ever wanted. Julia was my gateway to that world, and I had played my cards perfectly. Little did I know that her godfather, Mr. Hayden, had his own plans that would soon complicate my carefully laid out strategy. But in that moment, all I could think about was the wealth that was just within my reach. The day after Julia accepted my proposal, I was still riding the high of my success. The wedding was just a formality now. The real prize was the wealth that would come with it. I had spent the morning basking in the glow of my soon-to-be luxurious life, sipping coffee on the terrace of Julia's sprawling estate. The sun was shining. The birds were singing. It felt like the world was finally aligning in my favor. But that afternoon, my perfect plan hit its first snag. Julia and I were sitting in her father's old study, discussing wedding arrangements. The room was grand and imposing, lined with dark mahogany shelves, filled with books and mementos from her father's travels. The air was thick with the scent of leather and old paper, a fitting backdrop for the serious conversation that was about to unfold. As we discussed guest lists and venues, there was a knock at the door. Mr. Hayden, Julia's godfather, entered the room with a stern expression on his face. He was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a salt and pepper beard that only added to his air of authority. He had been a close friend of Julia's father, and I knew he wielded significant influence in her life. "Louis, Julia," Mr. Hayden began, nodding at each of us in turn. "There's something important we need to discuss before you finalize any wedding plans." Julia looked at him with a mix of curiosity and concern. "What is it, Uncle Hayden?" Mr. Hayden's eyes flicked to me, and I could sense the weight of his gaze. "A prenuptial agreement." I felt a cold shock run through me. A prenuptial agreement. That was the last thing I wanted to hear. But I couldn't let my dismay show. Not here. Not in front of him. "Why would we need that?" Julia asked, her voice filled with genuine confusion. "Louis and I love each other. We don't need a prenup." Mr. Hayden's expression softened slightly as he looked at Julia. "I understand that, dear, but this isn't about love. It's about protecting your father's legacy. You've inherited a substantial estate, and it's my duty to make sure it remains in safe hands." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Hayden, but I assure you I have no interest in Julia's wealth. My love for her is genuine." Mr. Hayden's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was trying to gauge the truth behind my words. "That may be so, Louis, but as her godfather, I must insist. This prenuptial agreement is non-negotiable. It will ensure that, should anything happen to the marriage, Julia's assets remain hers alone." Julia glanced at me, her expression torn. "Louis, what do you think?" I felt cornered. I knew I had to tread carefully here. Any sign of resistance could raise suspicion, but agreeing too readily could also backfire. I decided to play the dutiful fiancé. "Julia," I said softly, taking her hand in mine, "if this is what will make you and Mr. Hayden feel secure, then I'm willing to sign it. I don't want anything to come between us." She smiled at me, relieved. "Thank you, Louis. I knew you'd understand." Mr. Hayden, however, remained impassive. "Good. I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers. You can review them with your own attorney if you like." "Of course," I replied, still keeping that practiced smile in place. But inside, I was seething. This prenuptial agreement was a roadblock, a significant one. It wouldn't just limit my access to Julia's fortune, it would effectively lock me out of it entirely. As Mr. Hayden left the room, I felt the walls closing in. Julia, oblivious to the storm brewing within me, leaned against my shoulder and sighed. "I'm so glad that's settled," she murmured. "Now we can focus on the wedding." I kissed the top of her head, forcing myself to stay calm. "Yes, let's focus on the wedding," I said, my mind already racing with new plans. I couldn't afford to let this prenuptial agreement ruin everything. If I couldn't gain access to Julia's wealth through marriage, I'd have to find another way. And I would, no matter what it took. As the days passed, the reality of the prenuptial agreement weighed heavily on me. I had hoped it was just a formality, a gesture to appease Julia's godfather, Mr. Hayden, but the contract was airtight. I had spent hours reviewing it with a lawyer, searching for any loophole that might give me access to Julia's fortune, but Mr. Hayden's legal team had been thorough. Every clause, every line seemed designed to keep me at arm's length from the wealth I had married into. But I wasn't ready to give up. I believed that with enough charm and subtle influence, I could manipulate Julia into giving me access to her money without directly challenging the prenup. After all, she loved me, or at least she thought she did. And love, as I had learned over the years, could make people do things they wouldn't normally consider. One evening, as we sat together in the grand living room of Julia's estate, I decided to begin my campaign. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the fire, and Julia was curled up on the sofa, reading a book. She looked so serene, so trusting. I almost felt a pang of guilt, almost. "Julia," I began, my voice gentle and affectionate. "I've been thinking about our future." She looked up from her book, her eyes lighting up. "Oh, what about it?" "Well," I said, carefully choosing my words, "I've been thinking about some investment opportunities. There's this new development project in the city that I believe could really take off. It could secure our future, ensure that we never have to worry about money." She tilted her head slightly, a smile playing on her lips. "But we're already financially secure, Louis. My father left me more than enough." "Of course," I said quickly, "but it's not just about us. It's about building something together, something that we can pass on to our children someday. Wouldn't it be amazing to have a project that we could call our own?" She hesitated, her smile faltering. "Louis, you know I'm not really interested in business. My father's estate is more than enough for me. And besides, Uncle Hayden has been very clear about how we manage the finances. He thinks it's best to keep things as they are." I felt a surge of frustration, but kept my voice steady. "I understand that, Julia. But I want to contribute to our life together. I don't want to just live off your father's money. I want to add to it, to make it grow. I want to prove to you that I'm not just here for your wealth." She put down her book and reached for my hand, her expression softening. "Louis, you don't have to prove anything to me. I love you for who you are, not for what you can add to my father's fortune. I trust you, but I also trust Uncle Hayden's judgment. He's always had my best interests at heart." I smiled at her, though inwardly I was seething. Mr. Hayden again. That old man's influence over her was stronger than I had anticipated. I needed to find another way. "Of course, Julia," I said, squeezing her hand. "I just want to make sure we're prepared for anything that might come our way. But if you're not comfortable with it, we don't have to rush into anything." She smiled, relieved. "Thank you, Louis. I know you're just looking out for us. But I'm happy with things as they are. We're already so blessed." I nodded, keeping my frustration in check. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized that my subtle attempts to influence Julia were going nowhere. Every time I brought up the subject of investments or business opportunities, she would gently steer the conversation away, always citing Mr. Hayden's advice as the reason. It became clear that Julia wasn't going to budge. She was too content, too trusting of her godfather's guidance, to see things from my perspective. The more I tried to manipulate her, the more resistant she became, though always with that same gentle smile. One afternoon, I decided to try a different tactic. We were in the garden, enjoying the late summer sun, when I broached the subject again, this time with a different angle. "Julia," I said, my tone more serious, "I've been thinking a lot about our future, and I'm worried. What if something happens to us? What if, God forbid, there's an emergency and we need access to more funds quickly? The prenup limits what I can do to protect us." She looked at me, her brow furrowing with concern. "Louis, is there something you're not telling me? Are you worried about something specific?" I hesitated, realizing that I needed to be careful. "No, nothing specific. I've seen how quickly things can change in life. I don't want us to be caught off guard." Julia sighed, her expression softening. "Louis, I appreciate that you're thinking about our future, but I trust Uncle Hayden's judgment. He set up the prenup to protect both of us, and I believe he did it with our best interests at heart. We'll be fine, I promise." I knew then that I had failed. No matter how hard I tried, Julia's trust in Mr. Hayden and her contentment with her current situation were unshakable. My attempts to manipulate her had only reinforced her belief that the prenup was necessary. As we sat there in the garden, with the sun setting behind us, I realized that my plans were crumbling. Julia wasn't going to give me access to her wealth, no matter how hard I tried. I would have to find another way, something more drastic, more desperate. And as I watched her smile at me, completely unaware of the storm brewing within me, I knew that the time for subtlety was over. It all began with something so small, so seemingly insignificant that at first I barely noticed. Julia had been complaining of headaches for a few days, but I dismissed them as stress or exhaustion. She had always been a bit delicate, prone to overworking herself on her various charitable endeavors. I thought nothing of it, until the day she collapsed. It was a crisp autumn morning, and we were preparing for a charity event at the estate. Julia had been bustling about, directing the staff and ensuring everything was in order. She looked pale, but I attributed it to her usual anxiety before a big event. I was in my study, going over some documents, when I heard the crash. I rushed out to find Julia lying on the floor, unconscious. Her face was ashen, and her breathing was shallow. Panic gripped me, but not because I was worried for her. No, my thoughts immediately went to the implications. If she were seriously ill, what would that mean for me? For my plans, the doctor arrived quickly, an older man with a calm demeanor that I found infuriating given the circumstances. He examined Julia carefully, his expression growing graver with each passing moment. When he finally turned to me, I could see the worry in his eyes. "Mr. Sanchez," he said quietly, "your wife needs immediate attention. I'm concerned about her condition." I forced a look of concern, though inside, my mind was racing. "What do you mean? What's wrong with her?" He hesitated before answering. "I'm not certain yet, but her symptoms suggest something more serious than just exhaustion. We need to run some tests. I'd recommend taking her to the hospital right away." I nodded, knowing I had no choice. "Of course, whatever you think is best." Julia was taken to the hospital, where a series of tests were conducted. The days that followed were a blur of medical jargon and sterile white rooms. Julia was admitted for further observation, and the doctors were thorough in their evaluations. The initial diagnosis was worrying. A rare neurological condition, one that could deteriorate rapidly without proper treatment. I stayed by her side, playing the role of the concerned husband, but my mind was elsewhere. The prenuptial agreement loomed large in my thoughts. If Julia's condition worsened, if she didn't survive, I could finally be free of the constraints that Mr. Hayden had imposed. But it wouldn't be that simple. The will would surely be read, and I needed to ensure that I was in a position to gain what I had married her for. One evening, after Julia had been stabilized, I sat beside her bed, feigning concern as she slowly regained consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at me with a weak smile. "Louis," she whispered, her voice frail. "Thank you for staying with me." "Of course, Julia," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm here for you, always." She looked so vulnerable, so trusting. I almost felt a twinge of guilt, but I quickly pushed it aside. This was just another obstacle to overcome. "Julia," I said softly, "the doctors are doing everything they can. But you need to be strong. We'll get through this together." She nodded weakly. "I know, Louis, I'm just so tired. I never thought something like this would happen to me." "You'll get better," I said, more for my benefit than hers. "You're strong. You've always been strong." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm scared, Louis. What if I don't make it?" I tightened my grip on her hand, forcing a smile. "Don't talk like that, Julia. You're going to be fine. You just need to focus on getting better." But even as I spoke, I was already thinking ahead. If Julia didn't survive, I needed to be prepared. I needed to ensure that I could still access her wealth, despite the prenup. Perhaps I could convince her to make some changes to her will, to leave me in charge of the estate in the event of her passing. It would take careful manipulation, but I was confident I could do it. As the days turned into weeks, Julia's condition worsened. The doctors tried various treatments, but nothing seemed to help. She grew weaker with each passing day, her once vibrant spirit fading before my eyes. And yet she clung to life, her determination to survive almost admirable. One evening, as I sat by her bedside, Julia turned to me, her eyes filled with a quiet resignation. "Louis," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, if anything happens to me, promise me you'll take care of everything. The charities, the estate. Promise me you'll make sure everything is handled." I looked at her, my mind racing. This was the opportunity I had been waiting for. "Of course, Julia," I said softly, leaning closer. "I'll take care of everything, just as you want." She smiled weakly, a look of relief passing over her face. "Thank you, Louis. That means so much to me." But even as she thanked me, I knew that my words were empty. I didn't care about the charities or the estate. I cared about what they represented. The wealth, the power, the status. And now, with Julia so close to death, I was on the verge of finally claiming what I had married her for. But as the days continued, something unexpected happened. Julia's condition began to stabilize. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, saying that she might pull through after all. And as I watched her slowly regain her strength, I realized that my plans were slipping further out of reach. Julia was not dying, not yet. And as long as she lived, I was still bound by the prenuptial agreement, still trapped in a marriage that gave me none of the wealth I had sought. I knew I had to act fast. Julia's illness had bought me some time, but I needed to find a way to secure my position before she fully recovered. I needed to find a way to ensure that, no matter what happened, I would come out on top. But Julia, ever trusting, seemed oblivious to my intentions. She was focused on her recovery, on regaining her strength, and she continued to look to me for support. And so I played the role of the devoted husband, even as my mind plotted my next move. One night, as Julia lay asleep, I found myself alone in the house. I wandered through the halls, my thoughts heavy with frustration and fear. I had been so close to finally achieving what I had set out to do. But now, with Julia's recovery, everything was slipping away. And then, in the stillness of the night, an idea began to form in my mind. A desperate, dangerous idea. But it was the only way. If Julia recovered fully, I would be left with nothing. But if something were to happen, if her illness took a sudden turn for the worse, I shook the thought from my mind, horrified at the direction my thoughts had taken. But the seed had been planted, and as I stood alone in the darkened hall, I knew that I was running out of options. Julia had to die. There was no other way. But how? How could I make it happen without arousing suspicion? How could I ensure that her death seemed natural, a tragic result of her illness? It would take careful planning, precise execution. But I had no choice. Julia's life, or rather her death, was the key to my future. And as the days passed, I knew that I was willing to do whatever it took to secure what was rightfully mine. As Julia's health continued to decline, I noticed a change in her demeanor, a subtle shift that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the physical toll of her illness. There was something else, something she was hiding. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. After all, what could she possibly conceal from me? But as the days wore on, my suspicions grew. One evening, as I entered her room to check on her, I found her deep in conversation with Caden, a longtime family friend. Their voices were low, almost conspiratorial, and when they noticed me, they immediately stopped talking. Julia offered me a weak smile, but I could see the tension in her eyes. "Caden," I said, keeping my voice light, "I didn't realize you were here. Everything all right?" Caden stood up quickly, too quickly, and gave Julia a reassuring nod. "Yes, of course. I was just checking in on Julia. We were reminiscing about old times, nothing more." Julia nodded, though her expression was strained. "Yes, Louis. Caden was just being a good friend, as always." Something was definitely off. Caden excused himself shortly after, leaving me alone with Julia. I wanted to question her, to demand answers, but I knew I had to tread carefully. Julia was still fragile, and any confrontation could backfire. So I kept my suspicions to myself, biding my time. As the weeks passed, I noticed Caden visiting more frequently. Their conversations, always held behind closed doors, were growing longer, more secretive. I knew they were hiding something from me, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. I began to listen in on their conversations whenever I could, hoping to catch a clue, but they were always careful, speaking in hushed tones, with long silences between their words. Then one day, while Julia was asleep, I stumbled upon something that shook me to my core. I was going through her personal papers, looking for any signs of changes to her will or other legal documents, when I found a letter addressed to Caden. The letter was unfinished, and the contents were shocking. In the letter, Julia spoke of a child she had arranged to have with Caden. My heart raced as I read the words, barely able to believe what I was seeing. She had been planning this for months, maybe even years. The letter explained how she wanted Caden to take care of the child after she was gone, and how she had arranged everything to ensure that I would have no claim to her wealth. The child's name was Austin. I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. Julia had gone behind my back, had conspired with Caden to create an heir who would inherit everything that should have been mine. All my plans, all my careful manipulations, it was all falling apart. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I knew I had to be smart about it. I couldn't let her know that I had discovered her secret. Later that evening, I sat by her bedside, my mind racing with possibilities. She looked at me, her eyes tired but still filled with that same trust, that same love that I had always exploited. "Louis," she whispered, her voice weak, "there's something I need to tell you." I forced myself to remain calm, to keep my voice steady. "What is it, Julia?" She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "It's about Austin." The name sent a jolt through me, but I didn't let it show. "Austin? Who is Austin?" She looked away, her hand trembling as she reached for mine. He's my son, Louis. Our son." For a moment, I was speechless. The audacity of her lie was staggering. She was trying to pass off Caden's child as ours, thinking that I would be fooled, that I would somehow accept this. But I played along, feigning shock and confusion. "Our son," I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said, tears filling her eyes. "I couldn't tell you before. I didn't know how. But I wanted you to know, before it's too late." I squeezed her hand, pretending to be overwhelmed by the news. "Julia, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she replied, her voice breaking. "Just promise me you'll take care of him, that you'll love him as if he were your own." The gall of it all nearly made me lose my composure. "Of course, Julia," I said, my voice thick with false emotion. "I'll take care of him. I'll do whatever it takes." She smiled weakly, relief washing over her face. "Thank you, Louis. That means the world to me." As she drifted off to sleep, I sat there, seething with anger. Julia had outplayed me, had hidden this child, this heir, from me until the very end. She had made sure that I would be left with nothing, that everything would go to this child, Austin, who wasn't even mine. I knew I had to act quickly. Julia's time was running out, and once she was gone, the truth would come out. But what could I do? The will would be read, the estate would be divided, and I would be left with nothing. But then a thought struck me. What if there was a way to turn this to my advantage? What if I could find a way to discredit Caden, to prove that this child was illegitimate, or even better, to find a way to claim Austin as my own after Julia's death? It would be risky, but I had nothing to lose. I would need to be careful, to bide my time, to gather evidence. But I was confident that I could do it. Julia may have thought she had won, but I wasn't finished yet. As I sat there, watching her sleep, I made a silent vow to myself. I would not let Julia's plan succeed. I would find a way to take what was rightfully mine, no matter the cost. The game was far from over. The day Julia passed away was the day I had been waiting for, my opportunity to claim what I believed was rightfully mine. I had steeled myself for the reading of her will, convinced that my presence would be a mere formality before I walked away with my share of her fortune. The notary's office was a grand old building with high ceilings and polished wooden floors, a stark contrast to the chaos that was about to unfold. I arrived early, making sure to appear calm and collected, despite the roiling anticipation within me. Mr. Hayden, Julia's godfather, and the executor of her estate, was already there, his expression solemn as he reviewed the documents. Caden was present too, though he seemed more anxious than composed. I greeted them with a nod, though the air was thick with unspoken tension. "Mr. Lewis," Mr. Hayden said as he saw me, his voice tinged with a formal politeness that I found almost mocking. "I'm glad you could make it. Please, have a seat." "Thank you, Mr. Hayden," I replied, taking the seat across from him. "I'm eager to hear how Julia's estate will be divided." Caden, sitting next to Mr. Hayden, gave me a tight-lipped smile. "It's a difficult time for all of us, Lewis." I nodded, trying to maintain my composure. "Yes, I'm sure it is." Mr. Hayden took a deep breath and began to speak. "Julia has left very clear instructions regarding the distribution of her estate. We are here to ensure that her wishes are honored." He picked up the will, his eyes scanning over the document. I watched him intently, my heart racing as I anticipated the announcement of my inheritance. "Julia's will," Mr. Hayden said, his voice steady but laden with gravity, "has named her son, Austin, as the primary beneficiary of her estate." My heart sank, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. Austin. I thought Julia's wealth would be divided according to the prenuptial agreement. Mr. Hayden's eyes met mine with a hint of sympathy. The prenuptial agreement was indeed a significant factor, but Julia made specific provisions for her son. Austin is the sole heir to her estate. I felt a wave of disbelief and anger crash over me. Her son, but I was led to believe that there wouldn't be any other heirs. This is a complete surprise. Caden leaned forward, his face taut with the strain of the situation. "Lewis, Julia made these arrangements knowing she might not have much time. She wanted to ensure Austin was well cared for." I struggled to keep my voice steady. "So what does this mean for me? Am I left with nothing?" Mr. Hayden nodded solemnly. "Unfortunately, yes. Julia's will explicitly states that all her assets, including her estate and personal belongings, are to be transferred to Austin. The prenuptial agreement does not override her final wishes regarding her son." I felt a surge of frustration. This is outrageous. I was supposed to be a part of this estate. Julia and I were married. How can she just cut me out like this? Mr. Hayden's tone was firm but calm. Julia's decisions were clear and legally binding. The prenuptial agreement was to protect her assets from being unjustly claimed. Her will was designed to ensure her son's future. Caden's expression softened slightly, though there was an edge of satisfaction in his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss, Lewis." But Julia was adamant about her decisions. She wanted to make sure Austin would be secure. I stood up abruptly, unable to contain my anger. "This is an injustice. I refuse to accept this. There must be something I can do." Mr. Hayden's demeanor remained composed, though he looked weary. "Lewis, the will has been executed according to Julia's instructions. Any attempt to challenge it would require substantial legal grounds. I suggest you consult with your lawyer." As I stormed out of the office, I could feel the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me. Julia had outsmarted me, left me with nothing despite all my plans and manipulations. The knowledge that her fortune would go to a child, one I had no connection to, was a bitter pill to swallow. I needed to think quickly. The will had been executed, but I wasn't ready to accept defeat. There had to be a way to overturn this, to reclaim what I believed was rightfully mine. But for now, all I could do was process the shock and figure out my next move. I walked away from the notary's office, my mind a whirlwind of frustration and schemes. Julia had played her hand well, but I wasn't finished yet. I would find a way to get what I wanted, no matter what it took. The days following the notary's revelation felt like an endless descent into despair. I was unprepared for the reality that Julia had left her entire estate to her son, Austin, and not to me. The shock of it was compounded by the mounting frustration and humiliation I experienced as I tried, and failed, to fight the will in court. I spent the next few weeks in a haze, frantically contacting lawyers and attempting to find any legal loophole that could reverse Julia's final decision. Each meeting ended in disappointment, as my attempts to challenge the will proved futile. The prenuptial agreement was solid, and Julia's provisions for Austin were legally unassailable. My financial situation, once so promising, quickly deteriorated. The lavish lifestyle I had envisioned, fueled by Julia's wealth, was slipping away. With no inheritance to claim and mounting legal fees, I found myself sinking deeper into debt. I had been living beyond my means, counting on Julia's fortune to sustain my lifestyle. Now it was all unraveling. One evening, I met with Javier, a former associate who had once been an ally, but was now just another person witnessing my downfall. We met in a dimly lit bar, where the atmosphere seemed to mirror my mood, bleak and heavy. "Louis," Javier said, his voice barely audible over the low hum of conversation. "I heard about what happened with Julia's will. That's rough, man. I can't believe you're not getting anything." "Tell me about it," I replied, nursing a glass of whiskey. I thought I had everything planned out perfectly. I was so sure that I'd get my share. Javier shook his head sympathetically. "Well, you know how it is. People like Julia, when they're determined, they don't budge. I tried to warn you about the prenup." I slammed my glass down on the table. I thought I could outsmart it. I thought I could manipulate the situation. But it's like every step I take just makes things worse. Javier's gaze was steady. "Maybe it's time to accept the reality of the situation. You're in deep, and it's only going to get worse if you keep chasing after something that's not there." I stared at him, frustration and anger boiling over. "You don't get it, Javier. This wasn't just about money. It was about winning, about proving that I could have it all. Now, I'm left with nothing. I've lost everything I worked for." Javier's voice softened. "Look, I know it's hard, but sometimes you have to cut your losses and move on. Dwelling on it won't change the outcome." I dismissed his advice, unwilling to accept that I had been bested. I continued to fight against the will, escalating my attempts to discredit Julia's decisions and gather any evidence that could support my case. But every avenue I pursued was met with failure. In the midst of this, my personal life was falling apart. Friends and acquaintances who had once admired me now avoided me, their respect replaced by pity and disdain. The realization that I had become a laughingstock was crushing. The social circles I once navigated with ease now felt hostile and unforgiving. One evening, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life that seemed to be slipping through my fingers. I scrolled through the news, where I found articles discussing the legal battles over Julia's estate. My name appeared in the context of a failed attempt to contest the will, making my humiliation public. As I brooded over my situation, my phone rang. It was a call from Mr. Hayden. "Louis," he said, his voice as cold and impersonal as ever, "I wanted to inform you that your attempts to challenge the will have been unsuccessful. The court has upheld Julia's decisions, and all assets will be transferred to her son, Austin." I could barely muster a response. "I understand," Mr. Hayden continued. "I suggest you focus on rebuilding your life. The legal fees and your failed attempts will only add to your burden if you continue down this path." I hung up, the weight of Mr. Hayden's words pressing down on me. I had reached the end of my line, and there was nothing left to do but confront the fallout of my actions. As the weeks passed, I found myself increasingly isolated and bitter. My attempts at revenge had failed, and I had lost everything I had hoped to gain. The life I had envisioned was gone, replaced by a harsh reality that I had no choice but to accept. Louis, once a man of ambition and charm, was now a symbol of hubris and downfall. My dreams of wealth and status had crumbled, leaving me with nothing but a bitter resentment towards the woman who had outwitted me. I had underestimated Julia's resolve and the consequences of my own greed. As I sat alone, reflecting on the choices that led me here, I realized that my downfall was not just a loss of wealth, but a profound personal failure. The ambition that once drove me had become my undoing, and the pursuit of revenge had only deepened my despair.